Perfect. So yeah, as Isabel so kindly stated, my name is Bree. I apologize for the shaky camera work as I was at an event today that I ended up not having direct access to Wi-Fi. So I'm in my car and we're working with what we have, and I appreciate your patience. But it is an honor for me to be able to talk to you all.
Hey
Um,
Trey,
oh,
sorry. Ryan.
can we hear and everything? We're good. Okay. But anyway, so I've been working at Returned Home since its inception, essentially. But we did start research and development 2.5 years before we actually opened the facility. And so I was a funeral director in the traditional funeral industry for about 8 years before I started at Return Home. So I have a lot of traditional funeral experience and brought that experience to this new disposition method, which is so closely aligned with so many of our beliefs while we're alive. So, Isabel, you can go ahead and move forward. A little bit of how did we get here? So, Return Home became a business when Washington State was the first state and actually the first place in the world to legalize the process of what's legally called natural organic reduction. We call it terramation. You can skip to the next slide because terramation is the gentle transformation of human remains into soil. I say gentle, and I point that out specifically because not everybody who offers the body composting services have the same methods. Again, our team specifically, with the help, if you're taking notes, you'll want to write this down. His name is John Paul. He is a mortality composter and a PhD in soil science, and he's incredible. He's out of Abbotsford, Canada. And John Paul worked with the CEO of our company for 2.5 years on the development of the systems that Return Home uses to naturally reduce human remains into compost. We call it terramation, and then the remains at the end are called terramated remains. So um, that's kind of where we came from. And the reason I'm talking to you is like Isabel said, I have become I'm not an expert in all composting, and certainly not bagged up composting of leaves and things like that, but I am an expert in composting human bodies. And so I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about that and then answer all your questions about that today. All right. So, where we begin, and I like to have this on the side just for kind of a reference because you can kind of see what the stages are. And you can pretty much pull up everything, Isabel, because I'll just go through things as they pop up. First and foremost, educating people. That's what I'm doing here with you today. I was doing that in an event earlier at the University of Washington today, and basically just familiarizing people with the process of natural organic reduction because it is still, even though it's been legalized for several years now, a very new concept to most people. And if you find this is something you're interested in, you like to do, you want to participate in, you want to like build a facility or you want to have this done for yourself or your loved ones, education is first, right? We want to know how it works. We want to know the systems that are in process, making it so that the transformation is dignified, and so that's important. Isabel, if you would click through just yeah, there we go. So a few ways that we've done that and Return Home has reached out is obviously through things like state associations, composting associations and groups, helping with the testimonies for state legislature. We also offer virtual tours. We have a website that's very comprehensive that shows a lot of the detail of what we do. And then, of course, as Isabel mentioned earlier, we really, our business started forming at the peak of COVID. And so as a funeral director, I was familiar with really tangible hands-on outreach and ended up having to be really comfortable with sitting in front of a camera and filming myself doing things and filming my cohorts doing things. And that were unique to us and really showing people that there's a little bit of ick to death in general, I would say, but there's nothing more ick about composting a person than there is about cremating a person. So all of those things are very important to, point out, is that we just do so much education and outreach. Um, Again, FAQs, which at the end of this, hopefully I will have answered some of your questions, but I really love the Q&A because for me, it's the part where we really validate what we're doing. And of course, outside of today, we are a funeral home. So by nature, we are accessible 24/7. Um, Call us, get on our live chat, and ask us questions. That's what we're here for. A few core values for us specifically are going to be the sustainability of our process and the transparency. So, what makes Return Home special is the fact that you can walk in and you can see the Terramation process in action. Really special. So, um, in our Terramation process specifically, we have an 11,000-foot warehouse. It had to be crematory certified because the state didn't know where to put us as far as permitting. So we're in a really large industrial area, but what we're doing is quite the opposite, really. It's as old as nature and life is. But we've optimized the environment in which that takes place. So a person is placed inside of a vessel. It's usually an 8 foot by 3.5 by 3.5 foot. We do have some that are a little bit smaller for smaller individuals, but ultimately the body is placed inside of that vessel. That we are at all times controlling the oxygen, the temperature, and the moisture inside of the vessel. These things are imperative because it is an aerobic composting process, and you all know the difference between aerobic and anaerobic composting. But ultimately, we use straw alfalfa and sawdust specifically at very specific ratios to the person. So higher body content as far as fat content in the body is going to require a different mix than somebody who's emaciated. So we've had to refine our process to each specific person because no single body terramates the same. So we fill that 8 foot vessel about halfway full with straw alfalfa and sawdust. And then we place the person in. They can have services, they can have the time with their family. And then ultimately, we place a second layer of the organics on top. So the person is kind of cozied between those two layers. And they go to our racking system, which are 3 high, and ultimately stay there for the next 30 to 60 days while their body undergoes advanced decomposition. Next slide. So again, in that vessel, we're looking at 30 to 60 days where we have a cloud that's set up where 24/7 we're monitoring each individual person. And if something's off, if there's not enough oxygen flowing, or if there's too much moisture or too little moisture and too much air is going through, we're notified on our little app and it tells us and it says, hey, you need to make an adjustment to this person's vessel. And like I said, we're each individual vessel, so it's a pretty comprehensive tracking system, and we get access to it at all times. So at any time there's a red flag, is what we call them, we can address them immediately, remotely, or in person, which makes our system really cool. The microbes inside of our body that digest our food and that ultimately would break us down if we just, died out in nature without scavengers, right? We're dying out in nature and there's no animals there that want to consume what's left behind. Those microbes in our body are what break us down at the end of our life. And alfalfa has a ton of nitrogen in it. And so what we found is that the alfalfa, being nitrogen rich, really propels the process. And then, of course, the straw insulates and the sawdust will absorb. And so that's why we use those things. Over the course of 30 to 60 days, we do go to an external rotator after about 3 weeks into the process, because what we'll see is when we first place somebody in the vessel, they'll go on the racking system, we'll monitor them, and their temperature will rise. The state minimum is 131 degrees for no less than 72 hours in Washington, and that makes sure the pathogens are made inert, and that's, an important part of the process. We're typically sitting at like 150 degrees or so for like 3 weeks. What happens though eventually is we'll see that spike in temperature and then we'll gradually see it drop. And when the temperature drops, we know that anything that has microbes and is still in the vessel is not exposed to that nitrogen-rich alfalfa. We go to rotation the same way you might rotate your compost bin. It's external, it hugs the vessel, it spins, and ultimately reignites that microbial activity. What we do is we just watch that temperature rise and fall again. When the temperature becomes what we call ambient, we go to rotation again. And basically, we go to rotation every single time we see that dip in temperature until there's no rise in temperature. And at that point, we know that all the microbes, meaning all of the person's body and everything that it was made up of, has completely transformed into compost alongside of those organics. All that's left behind at that point are implants, things like metal and silicone that are in the body that we remove. And next slide, during the screening process. So our whole goal throughout the whole process is once the vessel is closed, we keep it closed. There's absolutely no opening of the vessel because it's not that it's like gnarly or weird in any way as much as it would just be tough for like human beings to maybe see somebody who's halfway through the transition of their body breaking down. So our whole goal is to keep the vessel closed until screening. When we go to screening, we are upending that vessel with another piece of equipment that was made for our vessels where we can slowly disperse the contents and ensure that we're getting anything inorganic out of the material. And then the bones are remaining. They don't disappear magically. And the bones and the leftover organics all go through a proprietary mechanism that by state law requires them to be uniform and unidentifiable. So the bones can't be, you can't look at the remains that we have left over and say, that's a bone right there. It has to be seamless with the rest. And so we, like I said, our soil scientist, John Paul, perfected the system by which that takes place. It's all done with conveyors and screens and ultimately a grinder very similarly to after a cremation takes place. So once that takes place, the person goes into what we call a cube. The cube is the space where there's no human body, so they're shorter, they're not as long as the vessels, and they're at that point just lowering in temperature after the spike of the microbial activity getting at that bone marrow. So we see the spike and then it drops and then it just continues to kind of drop and taper off over the next 30 days. We rotate pretty consistently. We aerate. We make sure that the remains are drying down a bit and that they're lowering in moisture and releasing a little CO2 before we, next slide, return them to the family with terrific results. There's that sense of humor you were promised. The terramated remains really are the most beautiful thing about what we do, and it's the reason why I'm in this right now. Early on, Micah, our CEO, brought me into the facilities, and everything was amazing and cool and flashy, and like, holy cow, this is this crazy new thing that they're doing. But really, what sold me was at the end, he showed me a container full of the remains because they had done all of that 2.5 years of testing on pigs. At this point, it was actually more like 2 years because I joined before we opened, but they had done all of the testing on pigs. And so they had piggy compost there. And I go in and I'm used to seeing ashes and I'm used to people going into the ground. I'm an embalmer. I embalm people, I preserve them. And I saw this most beautiful, fine beauty bark textured, amazing material that I'd never seen in my life before. And I'm a gardener. I'm a plant obsessed. If you ever visit Return Home, you'll see that. I immediately fell in love with the final product of the service. So as much as I love our service and our systems are, in my opinion, just the superior systems, and like I'm on the Return Home train. The thing that really sold me on it on the first place really was just the beauty of the end result, and it really is life giving, and you know that because you know compost is life giving. So next. It's important to point out there are critical factors, and I'm going to kind of gloss over these because they are more, if you're going to choose this related, and we can go into more detail, but essentially you have to go in nude. We can't have any clothing on the people because obviously they would, not break down during the process. We do make compostable gowns that are made of like cotton if you just pull it from the bush and just kind of flatten it out for services. But we even remove those at this point because there's just no point in having something separating the people from the organics. There's no use of formaldehyde allowed. And obviously, in the case of me, making sure people can say final goodbyes and things like that, have developed a lot of skills in unembalmed preparation of remains. We don't use any chemicals or inoculants of any kind. We are just letting the microbes in your body and that nitrogen rich alfalfa go. And of course, the time and the amount of remains are factors that people consider when choosing the service because it's a long time instead of a short time, where somebody might pass away and you might have a cremation take place within a couple weeks and the urn back. This is months. And you're not getting an urn sized amount of remains back, you're getting a cubic yard. And so these are things that people think about when pondering the service as, an option for them. Um, there's also, what we like to talk about is regulatory challenges. There's been a few bumps in the road because starting from the East Coast and moving your way west, the laws and regulations for the funeral industry really vary state by state. And so it's been really interesting to watch different states legalize, which you can see on this map. The dark green and the light green are the ones that are in consideration, right? They're contemplating adding it to their state offerings. Um, the permitting, the zoning, I kind of touched on that earlier, but they're equating it to cremation a lot of the times, which in this case, we don't have the same kind of off gassing. At Return Home, we use a biofilter that's essentially a shipping container full of chicken poop coated wood chips that absorb odor. And so we don't have odor, we don't have smoke. Hopefully, as time goes on, we see the regulatory like permitting and zoning chain a little bit. And a good example of another thing that's interesting is something versus like hands-on versus direct, where your family, in our case, really gets the opportunity to spend time. That's something that makes this process special is the ability to put your hands on your loved one and the hands that love you in life, continuing to love you in death. That's kind of part of our mantra. In states like New York, they're a direct disposition, which means you work with a funeral home for your funeral care and services, embalming, memorial services, funeral services, visitations, and then you work with the cemetery separately for the actual placement and interment. And so New York's rules are really weird for a composting facility like us, but they're great for a composting facility that has no interest in like meeting the community halfway. It's just like a place where you take your person, they get composted and you get the compost back and it's just a transaction. So it's really interesting for us to see how places are popping up and what their focus is. And yeah, I mean, just basically Return Home's just like heart focused. I don't even know what other way to say it, but we just lead with love. There's also a lot of cultural and religious hesitations. We can dip into that more in the Q&A if you want to, but those are some hurdles that we've encountered as time has gone on. And then again, our facilities are open to the public. So it was really important for me early on to not lose the sense of community and family. And in cremation specifically, so you're in New Mexico, I'm in Washington State. I'm not sure about your cremation percentages, but in Washington, we are like 90% in Pierce and King counties where I serve, 90% cremation. I think it's like 87%. Um, there's a lot of detachment with cremation because it's a very default, very easy, we're just going to do this because, it's the easiest, least expensive way to go about the disposition, having the person's body transformed. For us, it was really important to continue to honor and maybe even bring back a little bit the family ritual of it all, the cleaning off of the dining room table and the placing of the person's body and the anointing of oils and the prayers before they even call to send somebody to pick up the person. These are thoughts I thought about when building our facility, and that's why it is the way it is. That's why it's open to the public. So you can visit. I guess that's what I would like to say too. You can visit anytime, please. If you're ever in the Washington area, if you're in fly into SeaTac in Seattle, we're only like 15 minutes away. So you got to come see us. Um, and then a lot of people, of course, have questions about the environmental impact of what we're doing. And I think that that's a really fair inquiry. And we're not perfect. We do have a very large warehouse. We use tools, we use materials, but it's so much less, right, than what I saw in the traditional funeral industry as far as the use of concrete and rebar and metal and wood and just the extensive resource use that once we buy the thing, it's kind of done. We reuse our vessels. We have a forklift. We have the rotator. And the only thing that we're using as like a resource that comes in constantly that we're using is the organics, the straw, alfalfa, and sawdust, and office materials, of course. So like, paper for my printer and things of that nature. Um, but people have questions about the carbon footprint, and Return Home is a startup. We're also not venture backed. We're a very small little group of people who just have big passion. And so I don't have a ton to talk about as far as we've never had somebody do an internal audit or anything like that. But definitely way less resource. The Cornell Waste Management Institute has an amazing program dedicated to this right now. I definitely suggest looking into that. And then Death Curious is an online database that did do like research and study on the different impacts, and they talk about the difference between cremation, burial, natural organic reduction, and alkaline hydrolysis, which is also known as water cremation. Um, but here's what we know about terramation specifically, which no other disposition method offers in any way, and that is soil enrichment. We all know that the soil health in our planet is depleting at an alarming rate. We know that it needs restoration, and we also know that before the modern traditional funeral industry, and aside from like maybe mummification, there's not a lot separating us from the earth when we die, if we're talking several thousand years ago up until today, right? um it was the Civil War when embalming became prevalent in the United States. It wasn't even really readily practiced. So that means that people were going into the ground and they were giving back to this earth that we use. um that's the only part about this that makes it so amazing to me, is that there's not another disposition method. Green burial allows for that, but finding a true straight up green burial site is extremely difficult, because funeral homes and cemeteries will tell you that it's a green cemetery or a green burial, but they'll still require a vault to go over you so that the space doesn't get pitting and things like that. So green burial is probably my S tier. It's the absolute best, and I think that Terramation is between A and S. It's the top as far as you can really feel good about the fact that you're going to be able to put something back in the earth that has carbon and magnesium and phosphates, and you're sequestering all that into the soil, which I think that's just like the most beautiful thing. I love that. um and then, finally, know your facilities. I think that's a really important thing. I think it's the same as knowing your different types of composting at home. How transparent are they going to be? Are they going to talk to you about things? I always encourage people to do a lot of research if they're interested in starting a facility, or having this for themselves or their loved ones, because it's so different everywhere you go, and it really matters where people's priorities lie and where their morals lie. Because as you can imagine, composting human bodies, especially, I'm sure that you hear in the news all the time about the funeral homes that don't do it right with just like cremation and burial and things like that. It could go so terribly, terribly wrong with what we're doing. And I think the part that I'm so proud of is that we all care so much that that doesn't happen, that we've created a machine that is pretty seamless, and we don't have issues, like knock on wood, knock on. But we don't have a lot of issues anymore. At the beginning we had things here and there, but all in all, John Paul created this most beautiful system. And I don't always talk about this, but I will add that he created the system specifically thinking of his family, how he would want his family to be treated, and how he would want his family's composting to go, essentially, which I think is really beautiful. So my call to action today, please, if you're ever in the Seattle area, you have to come visit us. I will give you the best tour, and then we'll get you lunch after. You can follow us on socials. That's at Return Home NOR for Natural Organic Reduction. That is the best way to just see me be a goober and just try to get this out into the world as much as we can. And the monthly newsletter is really interesting, because every month our CEO, Micah, just kind of sends out a thing updating everybody on what we've done and things we've accomplished, and the funeral home awards that we've won, and so, which you can see in the picture there. So yeah, I don't know, it's just been such a beautiful ride, and I'm very grateful again to be here. So thank you all for having me. And I think this is the last slide. I think I'll be ready for Q&As and to chat and whatever else you have to throw at me.